first off, I mentioned that these are the winners of the 2019 and 2020 AWIARE and Levett Foundation Grant, Trevor Duke and Lindsey Parsons, and they both have work along the Gulf Coast. We're gonna have Lindsey go first. I'm sorry, Lindsey, if I didn't mention that before, we're gonna have you go first. And so I'll just give her bio first. So Lindsey is giving a talk today called Identifying the Effects of Climate Change on Prehistoric Scallop Harvesting in Tampa Bay. Lindsey Parsons is a second-year master's student in the geology department at the University of Georgia. Her focus is interdisciplinary in nature, combining the practices of paleontology and archaeology to understand the resource use of scallops by native communities along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Her project is being funded by this AWARE Levett Foundation Grant that she won. And she currently works as a research assistant at the Laboratory of Archaeology, working on an NSF-funded project. She completed her undergraduate geology degree at the University of Georgia as well in 2013. So I am gonna welcome Lindsey. I'm gonna stop sharing, and I'm gonna welcome Lindsey to share her screen. And then we'll get going. So everybody, again, please try to mute everyone. Let me see. Lindsey, just a second. I'm going to try to mute everyone and then unmute you so that we can just get that taken care of, okay? So that should have sent you a request. Okay, there you go, Lindsey. All right.
Hello. So as Cassie mentioned, I am using looking at the use of taphonomic and stable isotopic analysis in archaeological scallop deposits as key to how native coastal community harvesting practices were affected by climate change between 800 and 1850 in the Gulf Coast of Florida. So I am working in two different sites along the Gulf Coast, the first of which is the Pineland Site Complex located by Charlotte Harbor in the Pine Island Sound. The cultural affiliation with this site is the Calusa. And then farther north, I'm working in Bayshore Homes, which is in Tampa Bay area, and they were occupied by the Tocobaga and like a late Weedon Island time frame into Safety Harbor. The cool thing about these cultures are they are coastal communities where they would deposit extensive shell middens and mounds, and the mounds would be created for cultural purposes, burial purposes, as well as just infrastructure on within their communities. The mounds were made of shells from like scallops, oysters, hard clams, gastropod shells, and I'm focusing on scallops for my research. So within the Holocene, we have 4 known climatic periods. The Roman Warm Period, the Vandal Minimum, Medieval Warm Period, and the Little Ice Age. For my project, I'm focusing on the Medieval Warm Period and the Little Ice Age. Medieval Warm Period is from AD 800 to AD 1250, transitioning into the Little Ice Age from 1250 to 1850. Both of these climatic periods overlap the cultural sites, are part of the both Pineland site as well as the Bayshore Home site. And in 2019, I did an undergraduate research project using Pineland scallops. I had 77 scallops, half from Medieval Warm Period and half from the Little Ice Age, and I did a taphonomic analysis on the scallops. And I found some pretty cool things, and that's what really prompted my thesis work. So, back in 2019, I looked at, like I said, taphonomy, looking at adult body size, age ranges within the climatic intervals, as well as live dead ratios of the shells. So for adult body size in the Medieval Warm Period and then the Little Ice Age, I had much smaller adult body size for the scallops in the Medieval Warm Period than in the Little Ice Age. They were much larger. I also had 10 modern shells from Tampa Bay taken in 2018, and they reflected a similar adult body size as what we saw in the Medieval Warm Period. I also looked at age ranges of the scallops, and in the medieval warm period scallops coming from Pineland site, they range from small juveniles to mature adults, whereas in the Little Ice Age, most of the scallops were kind of heavy in the adult size range. And then finally, I looked at biota on the shell, both interior and exterior, looking at bioeroders and bioencrusters. The bioeroders, some of them were predatory in nature, which would drill completely through the shell, creating an interior borehole. And when that happened, those shells would be called, dead upon capture. And so in the medieval warm period, I had about a third of my shells that were in deposition be assumed to be dead upon capture, whereas in the Little Ice Age, I had much fewer shells that were dead in deposition. So the purpose of my study is to look at argopectin iridians, the scallops, as a food resource for these native communities, looking at body size, taphonomy, as well as stable isotopes. I'm using both oxygen and carbon stable isotopic analysis. Looking at the two climatic periods, the medieval warm period transitioning into the Little Ice Age. So for each individual site, both the Pineland and the Bayshore home site, I'll separate them into the two different climatic intervals, looking and comparing between the two, the harvesting methods employed by the native communities, the marine conditions at the time of collection, as well as the season of capture. So a little bit more about the bay scallop. They like to live in estuarine conditions and seagrass beds. They live in 1 to 2 meters of water, and they live to about 18 to 24 months depending on environmental conditions. So they have a hard time, they start struggling when temperatures become too hot and salinity becomes too low. And in these unfavorable conditions, if it's a short-lived unfavorable condition, they'll just stop growing, conserve that energy, and then if it's long-lasting, these unfavorable conditions, unfortunately, you'll experience some mortality rates. So the objective of my study is to use taphonomic analysis and stable isotopic analysis to understand harvesting methods, marine conditions, and season of capture. For taphonomy, I'm looking at harvesting methods more specifically, looking at, again, that bulk age range, and live dead ratios that I looked at in the Pineland site, now comparing them to the Bayshore home site as well. For stable isotopes, I'm looking more at marine conditions and season of capture of these scallop shells, looking at oxygen delta O18, more specifically at the amplitude of the sinusoidal curve that I'm hoping to get, going from the full long axis of growth. Looking at amplitude, which would tell me more about seasonality during the time of the scallop's life, as well as more positive or negative values between the two climatic intervals, the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. And for delta C13, the carbon stable isotope, I'm just looking at metabolic activity in the juvenile stage of the scallop, whether it be more positive or more negative, talking about marine productivity at that time. So because I've already done preliminary research on the Pineland scallops, I'm predicting that the Bayshore home scallops will show a similar trend. So I'm looking again, and what I'm expecting to see out of the Bayshore home scallops is that during the medieval warm period, the adult body size, or 2+ years, will be a smaller adult body size in deposition that we'll see, and then the Little Ice Age will have larger adult scallops. I also will look at the age ranges, and I'm predicting this, like, again, the similar thing as that I saw on Pineland site, just because of the common cultural practices. So age range, I'll have like a juveniles to adults, and a wider range. And then in the Little Ice Age, I'll have a smaller range of age where it's mostly adults and you have more of a common size. And then finally, I'll be looking at the biota on the shell again, interpreting the live dead ratio. And so again, in the medieval warm period, we have a higher ratio, more dead shells in deposition at time of collection. In the Little Ice Age, the shells that they're bringing in are actually used as a food resource, and they're not just empty shells. So what I'm interpreting this to mean is that during the medieval warm period, these native communities were bulk collecting their scallops. Maybe they, that's where they're getting these empty shells and various size ranges, that maybe the scallops just weren't as good of a resource during the medieval warm period just because of the high temperatures and the high rainfall causing their environment to not be as advantageous. And then for the Little Ice Age, I am suggesting that these cultural communities are harvesting by hand-selecting individuals, where they're going for more quality over quantity. So they're able to get larger scallops, more consistent body size, and they're able to bring them in as a food resource rather than just having like a shell bycatch. So for the stable isotopes predictions, I am looking at delta O18 and delta C13 again, split between the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. So I'm looking specifically at amplitude and more positive negative trends for the delta O18. For amplitude, that's going to tell me a little bit more about seasonality and the difference between like the hottest months and the coldest months within that time frame or the climatic interval. So for the medieval warm period, I'm predicting that I'm going to have a dampened amplitude or a dampened seasonality during that time. Whereas in the Little Ice Age, I'll have a larger amplitude showing more seasonality, where you're going to have more moderate summers and more intense winters, as well as more positive and negative. I'm going to compare the medieval warm period scallops to the Little Ice Age scallops, and I predict that the medieval warm period scallops will show a more negative delta O18 value, and the Little Ice Age will show a more positive delta O18 value because of a temperature trend. The carbon delta C13 metabolic carbon. So in scallops, in the juvenile stage of scallops, their metabolic activity is higher than and it progressively becomes less and less as they age. This is reflected in the delta C13 values as a more positive delta C13 trend in the juvenile stage, and then becoming more negative with age. Because the Little Ice Age has proven to be a more advantageous, marine conditions for the scallops, I'm predicting that the metabolic activity of the scallops in the juvenile stage during the Little Ice Age will reflect a more positive delta C13 trend. And finally, I'm looking at the season of capture of these scallops. I'm looking at the delta O18 value of that final season of growth on the end of this, hopefully, sinusoidal curve that I'll be getting from the stable isotopes to tell me when, in what season, these scallops are being collected, whether they're being collected all in the same season, like a high summer or a winter, or if they're being collected just kind of at random. And this will tell me if they're a seasonal food resource or a year-round, all-the-time food resource for these native communities. So like I said, I have two different sites that I'm working with. The Pineland site, I have 77 total scallops from that site. This is the Pine Island Sound Complex right here. And we are working with Mound 1 and the Randall Complex right here. So if we zoom in, this is Mound 1. I have 39 scallops from here. This is a mound site. And then Randall Complex right here is a midden site, and I have 38 scallops from there. Now in Bayshore Holmes, I'm working with 109 scallops, and they come from Bayshore Holmes site, and they're from a shell midden ridge, and they're on the inland side of the shell midden ridge, and they come from test unit 2. So to get the body size and age estimations for my shells for using just taphonomy, I'm measuring from the umbo to the final season of growth on the longest axis of growth to get the body size. To estimate age, I'm using these growth succession lines. As mentioned before, when scallops are in times of unfavorable conditions, high summers or high winters, they will actually cease growth and lay down these growth succession lines. In literature, it states that the change between the two growth succession lines represents a year of growth, and I hope to match these growth succession lines with my delta O18 value of my stable isotopic analysis to understand which seasons they're actually laying down these growth succession lines in. I'm also looking at the biota on the shells as part of my taphonomic analysis. I'm looking at bioeroders and bioencrusters. My bioeroders are going to be things that, like entobia, they're caused by sponges. Bionins are caused by polychaete worms. And then they also have these gastropods or predatory bioeroders. And these actually will kill the shell if they drill all the way through. So whenever I see an interior boring just like this, I would consider that shell dead upon collection and had been collected just as an empty shell rather than a shell that could be used as a food resource. I'm also looking at bioencrusters on the shells, such as oysters and barnacles. And this will give me a little bit of insight on the marine productivity at that time. So for stable isotopes, I'm going to be drilling every 2 millimeters up the longest axis of the growth of the shell, starting with the umbo to the final season of growth. I'm splitting up the sites between the 2 climatic intervals. So for Pineland, I would have 10 total shells, 5 from the medieval warm and 5 from the Little Ice Age, and then compare those 2 shells. In addition to my archaeological sites, I'll also be drilling and doing an analysis on my modern shells that I got from Tampa Bay in 2018 and compare that to water data from NOAA that I have, that we were able to get on the record. So the significance of my research is to understand how the climatic changes are reflected in estuarine environments along the Gulf Coast of Florida, especially in archaeological deposits, and how these climatic changes affected the native communities at the time. So such as changing in harvesting methods or, having to adjust accordingly to still get the resources that they had available to them. I also would want to emphasize the use of scallops as a food resource, whether or not they were the season of capture, if they were seasonal, or if they were year-round food resources. And then just understand that scallops are an important environmental culture indicators. They have a short lifespan, but they have a really fast rate of growth. So they're able to deposit lots of records in a short amount of time. And since they're commonly in deposition in these coastal or Gulf coastal environments, they can be a really good, we can use them to tell us a little bit more about the environment and cultural aspects at that time. So as Cassie mentioned, I was awarded the AWIARE Levett Foundation Award in 2020 to support my master's research. But prior to that, in 2019, I was awarded the Curo Award to support my preliminary research. And for those who don't know, at University of Georgia, Curo stands for Center for Undergrad Research Opportunities. And I was able to present 2 posters for that, which was super fun. This is the references for some of the facts I mentioned in the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to go back to the slides that they are associated with for you if you'd like. And then if you have any questions, we'll wait till the end. But that is all. I look forward to discussing more with you. Is that all right?
All right. Thanks so much. Now, Jamie, you gonna do the intro?
Okay, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself for some reason. All right, thank you, Lindsay. So next up, we have Trevor Duke, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Florida. His research focuses on how people use labor and objects to create social relationships. His dissertation research centers around developing new methods for investigating pottery specialization in small-scale societies. And his lecture tonight is titled Fancy Pots for Tough Times, Ritual Specialization in the Southeastern US. So go ahead, Trevor, thank you.
Hey gang, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, let me share my screen. Is that good? Everyone see that? Okay,
Looks
cool.
good.
All right, great. Well, anyways, thanks everybody for coming here. I'm really thrilled to be presenting in front of you all, mostly because since this is the Central Gulf Coast Archaeological Society meeting, I imagine most of you are in the Tampa Bay region or somewhere, Crystal River-ish. So this is exactly, my research location. So I'm happy to share this stuff with you all. This is basically going to be an overview of my dissertation research, what I've managed to do with the AWIARE funds that I was awarded through the Levett Foundation Grant thus far, and sort of where my, where the rest of my research is going to be taking me for the next year or so when I hopefully finish. So anyways, I'll go ahead and get started. My dissertation research specifically investigates how changing historical conditions themselves create different forms of craft specialization or create create the need for different kinds of craft production in non-hierarchical societies. And what I mean by non-hierarchical, I mean groups of people that don't have any sort of centralized governing body. This applies to most of the hunter-gatherer societies of the woodlands and to some extent the Mississippian Southeast, especially the Weedon Island, the Late Woodland, Weedon Island, and later Mississippian safety harbor societies that I'm researching. And I will explain more why that's important in a minute, because much of craft specialization has to do with, or in the past has had to do with political organizations. So I'm going to explain how my research is kind of like a fresh take on that. Yeah, so I'm interested in how different historical conditions create different kinds of people. What I mean by different kinds of people are different kinds of people with different motivation interests for doing certain things, right? And I'm going to use some cheesy Game of Thrones references to illustrate my point later. But I'll go ahead and take you through some more background first. Oops. Okay. So why is specialization a topic of interest for archaeologists, and what do I mean by that? Specialists in general they're usually skilled craftspeople that provision beyond their household. Basically, they provision for demands that extend beyond their village, and this kind of creates interdependence between people and between communities. Right, our society, whether we think of ourselves as specialists or not, modern U.S. society, Western society, is highly specialized in the sense that we basically, our labor is entirely dedicated to one or few tasks, right? And this is something that classic anthropologists like Emil Durkheim and Gordon Childs said was characteristic of increasing social complexity. And what I mean by that is it's basically a hallmarker of political centralization or political complexity, complex forms of social or centralized government. And the reason people have thought this, anthropologists have thought that you need really centralized government for specialization, is because, in their logic, basically specialists, because they work full time doing something, whether it's making pottery or whatever else, they need some kind of support, something to support their work, either in the form of wealth payments, subsistence payments. So that usually requires some kind of food production, right? So typically not supposed to apply to non-centralized societies, mobile hunter-gatherers that don't have, that are not agriculturalists, that don't have centralized food production. But we know from several studies on the woodland period, especially from Kate Spielman's work, but also some work by Neil Wallace, that that's not necessarily the case. That communities will often pitch in to help fund a specialist, gear up for big ceremonies like Hopewell ceremonies, or in the case of the Southeast, the ones that took place at these big civic ceremonial complexes that I'll explain in just a minute. But what's also interesting about specialization is that it can tell archaeologists a lot more about social categorization, how people, the relationship between skill and how people classify themselves, but also how other people classify them. So then you can start talking about discrete people in the archaeological record, which is something that I think has evaded much, sort of archaeological inquiry over the last, the last 50 to 100 years. So anyways, yeah, as I've already kind of mentioned this, I'm not going to belabor the point. This is a classic work by Elizabeth Brumfield and Tim Earle. This is sort of the classic reference on specialization in archaeology. It really came out of this neo-evolutionary kind of framework, again, where states, you could expect to find specialization in state-level context with centralized political authority. You have an elite to fund their work. And versus mobile societies are supposed to be more generalist. They don't specialize in any one task. They're moving around constantly. Much of their day-to-day routine requires them to have sort of more generalized capabilities in terms of, basket weaving, pottery making, fishing, whatever it is. You're doing a lot of different tasks at the same time. So that's not supposed to apply to the kind of societies that I'm talking about. But there's some reasons to think that that might not be the case. So yeah, again, these are that sort of perspective is mostly been derived from Andean and Mesoamerican states. So I'm thinking of the state level societies of Peru and Mexico, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, the Chimu, all these things. But again, that's kind of an evolutionary perspective, and I don't mean evolution in terms of biological evolution, but in terms of social evolution. Is that once you evolve from a sort of tribal level society to a chieftain level society, then into a state, that's when you can have specialized production. And what I'm saying, I'm operationalizing a historical approach, which means that the relationships between people, specific relationships that create the kind of the motivations and interests for people to engage craft specialization, those are the kinds of things that can also create different forms of craft production in small scale societies. So you don't necessarily have to have, you know, this specific type of social evolution to have, you know, specialized production, especially in also a pottery, okay? And so what I'm really interested is what kind of specialists might certain historical conditions create in these non-integrated societies, these small scale societies I'm talking about. So we have this Weedon Island example. For those of you that live down in St. Pete and Tampa, you all know about Weedon Island. This is Weedon Island. I don't know why, you know, Gordon Willey or whoever chose to spell the cultural historical type differently than the actual site. But regardless, this has been sort of one of North America's shining examples, although seldom excavated or seldom investigated, excuse me, one of the shining examples of potential specialization. Gordon Willey, I'm going to read this quote really fast. Gordon Willey called it the most outstanding of the Gulf Coast and in many respects of the entire Aboriginal United States. And keep in mind that these are mostly mortuary wares. There's certainly a domestic series of Weedon Island pottery, but I'm mostly looking at mortuary context for my dissertation because this is where, you know, sort of the fancy, well-made pots seem to be most common. And in the Tampa Bay region, they're almost completely absent from village midden context. So you only find them in burials. So I'm really interested in the possibility of this emergence of specialization surrounding mortuary ceremonialism and ritual activity. You know, some people have speculated that these potters were, you know, high-ranking religious officials with, you know, political and social clout. Although that's, you know, not entirely proven yet. So again, you know, what would be mostly, if this is true, this is really true, if these specialists were people that possess capabilities, you know, well beyond your average domestic potter, they were people that started spending much more time, dedicating more time to producing pottery than everyone else. It's really compelling because it would have occurred in a time of really political decentralization. It's kind of the opposite of what you would expect based on the evolutionary model. There's a lot of evidence. Tom Placon's, you know, recent work and Neil Wallace's recent work suggests that there's a really sort of, at least in the Florida Peninsula, there's a massive breakdown of these classic civic ceremonial centers, these big sites that were draws for people for hundreds of years, and in some cases almost 1,000 years. People are really moving all across the landscape, and they're sort of abandoning their ancestral homelands and moving all over the place. And they eventually re-aggregate in a lot of different places during the Mississippian. And one of those is the Tampa Bay region of Florida, which became what we call Safety Harbor, this Mississippian manifestation down there. Anyway, so that's what is, you know, completely compelling to me about this, is that if this was specialization occurring, then it would have happened in the midst of sort of this social upheaval, almost a state of panic when everybody is leaving, you know, these civic ceremonial centers. It's not happening when times are good. It seems to be happening when things are, you know, social networks are kind of breaking down. So, yeah, so I have this hypothesis. Sorry, I'm in hypothesis mode because I just wrote an NSF proposal, National Science Foundation Grant proposal. But I've come up with these two models for testing this, because I'm looking at historical conditions. I'm looking at historical change from the Weedon Island to Safety Harbor period. And one reason I chose Tampa Bay specifically is because that area is kind of unique, and that it shows, these burial mounds show evidence of both Weedon Island and Safety Harbor, the later Mississippian Safety Harbor period pottery. So what's so fascinating about this, or what's so unique about this, I guess, is that these sites show evidence of both occupations, of sort of diachronic use of the mounds, which is really pretty rare. A lot of these big civic ceremonial centers that were abandoned after, say, 8650 or 700, say Crystal River or Kolomoki, don't really show evidence of Mississippian occupation at all. So I have a rare opportunity to kind of have, you know, this diachronic comparison of pottery specialization in mortuary context in the same region. So I can, you know, trace the historical circumstances that created one type of specialist potentially, and then what led to another, right? So there's evidence, excuse me. So there is evidence for widespread exchange. I'm sort of foreshadowing some of Neil Wallace's work, but he and I are publishing an article on this soon. This is neutron activation analysis work. It's a chemical technique for sourcing pottery. Basically you just, different clays in different regions have different chemical signatures, right? And you can tell, so therefore you can tell when pots were exchanged across regions, especially broad physiographic zones like between Southwest Georgia and the Tampa Bay region. So there's evidence for a lot of exchange for mortuary ceremonialism, at least, especially in the Tampa Bay region. Many of the vessels that are found in mounds in Tampa Bay, including Safford Mound, one of the mounds I'm analyzing for my dissertation, shows evidence of non-local exchange, a really strong connection with Kolomoki in particular, but also other sites in north central Florida like McKeithen. And it mostly seems to be revolving around mortuary ceremonialism. So if there is specialization, it seems to have, or coming about during the Weedon Island period for this pottery production, it seems to be religiously motivated. And I can explain more later, and if we have time for questions. But anyways, what's interesting is that Ken Sassman and Jason O'Donoghue have recently argued that there's evidence for climate change. There's certainly the Vandal minimum period that we all know about, but there's definitely some climate change, some fairly severe climatic oscillations and fluctuations that happen right as these civic ceremonial centers are being abandoned. And they argue that it's basically creating a gap between ancestral knowledge and daily experience. So the extent to which people can draw on their past experiences to predict either a future or explain what they're currently going through is kind of fading a little bit. And so that kind of thing can create uncertainty. We saw this with Captain Cook's arrival of, can everyone hear me still? I'm sorry, my internet is wavering.
You're good.
Okay. Anyway, so we saw this with Captain Cook's arrival to the Hawaiian Islands. They couldn't really explain his arrival there. So it's kind of called for a reconstitution of a lot of their social networks. So these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about as drivers for, this sort of emergence of ritual specialists in this time frame. Anyways, as I said, so I think that this kind of uncertainty, this abandonment of these civic ceremonial centers, this potential climate change, prompted, a network of integrated ritual specialists. These specialists that were located not in central locations, but they were certainly located at prominent civic ceremonial centers, places like Kolomoki, and possibly the McKeithen site in north central Florida. So what would I expect this to look like? I'm hypothesizing about it, in this sort of abstract sense, but what's it supposed to look like on the ground? Okay. Well, Max Weber in one of his classic studies said that, when this happens, when religion or religious leaders emerge specifically to deal with, uncertainty or some sort of crisis, they will have to demonstrate their innovative capacity to sort of deal with the crisis and to restore order through their creativity and innovation, through doing things that nobody has done before. And this is what we see. Weedon Island pottery production is very novel in many respects. You see the appearance of effigy vessels, of human figurines on the vessels, and sizing and punctating, which is a complete departure from the stamped vessels of the prior Swift Creek period. So it appears to be, this appears to at least kind of fit this model of religious specialization in the sense that, Weedon Island potters seem to be doing something extravagant and creative. And I expect, Weber also said that religious institutionalization, for it really to take hold, for it to be effective in creating social change, it has to be institutionalized. And that basically means that it's far-reaching and that it has practitioners in multiple locations, right? So for this model to really be true archaeologically, one, I have to evaluate if these potters are skilled, and I'll explain my method for doing that in just a minute, but also that that these potters are linked in this ritual network. So they're exchanging either with one another, or they all have a common code of conduct for producing these vessels before they exchange them out. So I expect in the Tampa Bay region, if they're not being made there, that they're coming from a few sort of, religious hubs that are, integrating and potentially institutionalizing this sort of religious order. So fast forward a couple hundred years, keep in mind this Weedon Island period that I'm talking about is roughly 8650 to 1000. So we see a big shift in social organization during the safety harbor period. So you can see there that a lot of these sites now are around AD 1050 are very close to one another. They're all kind of within eye shot. Everyone's in each other's business. I'm going to back up a little bit. This pattern completely contrasts, completely contrasts the woodland pattern, where all these civic ceremonial centers, these major civic ceremonial centers, are usually at least 50 or 60 miles apart. So people weren't really seeing, surveilling each other's daily activities and things like this. That changes pretty drastically during the safety harbor period. As you can see, this is a layout. Those red dots, sorry, I should have labeled it. But these red dots are major platform mound centers in the Tampa Bay region during the Mississippian period. And it's basically my hunch, I'll just explain this Game of Thrones reference in a second. It's basically my hunch that after reading a lot of ethnographic literature, especially Claude Lévi-Strauss and a few others, social competition can become really prominent in these kinds of scenarios where people are not only competing for economic resources when they're all sort of crammed into space like that, they're also intensely competing for rights to political titles and property, inheritance rights, all these kinds of things, prestige. And this really manifests very strongly in times of, like I said, dense settlement aggregation. There are a lot of case studies of this in the southwestern United States, that people start becoming really competitive. And one thing that they do is they become very secretive about their crafting. They try to commandeer crafting a certain kind of craft, whether it's mortuary pottery, whether it's stone masonry. They will try to tie their identity to that craft so that they differentiate themselves from somebody else. And that also gives them heritable property rights, something that they can sort of transmit to a future generation. Okay, and that helps them sort of stabilize themselves and acquire political titles during these kinds of times of competition. And so I'm using the example of Game of Thrones. I guess I'll go ahead and get into it. This was Ned Stark's sword. Okay, this thing, I hope I have some Game of Thrones fans out there. But this is, I think the sword's name was Ice, right? And it was made of Valyrian steel. Okay, and obviously we know that the social houses, were really competitive. I think that George R.R. Martin read a lot of Claude Lévi-Strauss because he's basically taken his house society model and used it to write Game of Thrones. But anyways, this is an example of the use of an heirloom to create political legitimacy. People that had access to these this Valyrian steel, these kinds of swords, not just used it in battle, but it was a sign of their tie to a distinguished past. This is really kind of important. This, sort of putting your identity on display when you're competing with other people for lots of, again, social titles and things like this. And there's evidence to suggest that some safety harbors might be doing this with Weedon Island pottery. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go into Grog Temper. So unlike temper is the stuff that potters use to crush, they crush aplastic inclusions up, they put it in clay, and it helps them make a better pot. And it gives them all this nice characteristics that they can use for firing, for forming, because you can't really fire clay by itself, right? And so they've been using sand for a couple thousand years at this point in the Tampa Bay region. All of a sudden, at least for the mortuary pottery specifically, they start using grog. They start using crushed pottery. All right, and what's interesting is we can tell by mineral inclusions that a lot of this grog is non-local to the Tampa Bay region. And we know that non-local trade was very common during the Weedon Island period. There's not much evidence of non-local production of the later safety harbor vessels, but there's a lot of evidence of these micaceous pots. You see this Group C Grog Temper. That is a crushed up, potentially Weedon Island vessel that's been mixed up into the vessel matrix and used as timber. And then you see the sherd next to it is actually, that's what we call a multi-generational grog sherd. If you can see, that's a petrographic thin section, and that is a piece of pottery embedded in another piece of pottery with two other sherds embedded inside of that. So that sherd has been recycled in 3 different contexts now, in mortuary context specifically. So they're clearly heirlooming vessels in some fashion and putting it in new pots. And this heirlooming of vessels can become really common. It was really common in Maya context, actually, when there was sort of this diminishment, I guess you could call, of skill in stone masonry. What they did in the post-classic is they would go grab all the finely made stone masonry of their ancestors, and they would use it, they would put it in their house to legitimate themselves, to say, hey, this is our ancestry, this is who we come from. And then they would start making, they would actually become stone masons themselves, but they have to train new people to do it because those training networks, you know, broke down after the, you know, after a series of collapses and abandonment. And I think something similar happened during the Weedon Island period. I think there was a breakdown in the pottery training networks. And so they're potentially, you know, looking to their past or looking at the fine craftsmanship of the Weedon Island potters to, you know, sort of legitimate their own identity and their ancestry. Anyways, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm developing new methods for assessing skill. There are typically been two approaches to evaluating specialization. One is standardization, and that typically applies to state level context where, you know, we expect almost like a conveyor belt like construction. So each vessel is going to be very similar. But if, like I've hypothesized, if these Weedon Island potters, if their sort of specialization was all based on creativity and innovation, no two pots are going to be the same. They're not going to be standardized at all. So that's not a good way for me to assess specialization. Another way is developed by Patricia Crown is by this sort of qualitative scoring method. They just kind of look at the execution on the pot. The problem, and you can score it and basically come up with a ranking system based on execution as a proxy for skill and specialization. The problem with this is that if you haven't followed around dozens of potters like Patty Crown has, you can't really assess this. So I'm looking for quantitative methods of doing so. Anyways, I'm standardizing measurements across the vessel wall surface so that I can look at the consistency in vessel wall, because as potters work with clay, as their body habits become routine, they become much more consistent in their movements. There aren't any lumps in the pottery wall surface. So a skilled potter is going to have a much more even sort of wall surface and surface treatment than a novice or a learner. Okay, and so this is just an example of how I'm evaluating this. I'm using a coefficient of variation. I don't have to talk about that. But anyways, this vessel wall symmetry is also a good indicator of good versus poor execution. You can see the one on the left is well executed, the one on the right is poor. That's a Weedon Island vessel on the left and the Safety Harbor vessel on the right. And this is an example of surface treatment too. On the left, you have a skilled vessel. The lines are uniform. There's very little variation between them. And then, you know, that later Safety Harbor vessel shows, you know, it's quite a bit of shakiness, lack of motor control on that vessel as well. So anyways, I'm using neutron activation analysis, laser ablation. I have to use laser ablation to source the Grog sherds because I want to isolate that from matrix. So I have to use spot chemical analyses technique. And I also use petrography point count to quantify the sort of the matrix and all the fabric constituents so that I can compare paste recipes, potential specialist potters versus your average domestic potters. Going in for ICP-MS work next week, actually. I'm putting a few samples into the mass spec next Thursday, I believe. So looking forward to that. Anyways, huge shout out to all the folks at AWIARE and to the Francis and Gertrude Levett Foundation for funding my research and giving me this opportunity. It's been really fruitful so far. Hope Bob's happy with what I'm going to give him here pretty soon. And my advisor, along with everybody else I've mentioned in there, you know, I couldn't have done it without you. And thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I'd love to hear your questions. Sorry for going over.
Thanks, Trevor. That was great. Well, we have some questions for both of you. So I grabbed them out of the chat, but if anyone has other questions, throw them in the chat too, and I'll ask them. First, for you, Trevor, Bob asked a question. He said, do specialists have to produce only for outside their community? Can't skilled individuals produce goods for others in as well as or in addition to outside their community?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely can. But that's a kind of, you know, community level specialization that I don't think would be that novel for the societies, the type of societies that I'm discussing. I mean, I think that's certainly a possibility, and it's even probable. It would be difficult to, I guess, the best way to assess that would be through like a technological style analysis, because obviously the sourcing is not going to be, the provenance is not going to be different enough in the same village to really assess something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly a possibility, and something that I'm considering. And again, with the Safety Harbor example, I think that is kind of what's going on, is that the specialists, if they are specialists indeed, they're going to be mostly provisioning for those demands around the Tampa Bay region. So they're not necessarily extending it very far beyond their household. So I don't really have a good answer for that, but that's just a spiel.
That's good. All right, Lindsey, the next question is for you. How does today's climatic conditions, this is a question from Heidi, how do today's climatic conditions compare to those in the medieval warm period? Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Great question, Heidi. So, as a result of my research so far, we've seen, as climate changes, the harvesting practices are assumed to be changing as well as a result of, change in scallop, presence in the bays and estuarine areas. So, today in Tampa Bay, we're seeing especially just a loss, or, just not seeing as many scallops there, and that's affecting the scalloping season. So we're seeing the scalloping seasons move in Florida to away from those estuarine areas to more normal marine conditions like on Anclote Key, and things like that. So yeah, we do see a similar trend where, because of climatic change and, inability for scallops to, their unfavorable conditions for them to really thrive, we're having to change our way of harvesting to kind of protect them, as well as, we want everybody wants scallops. And so we want to make sure that we're still getting that resource, or we're changing the way we harvest as a, effect of that.
Thank you. Okay, Trevor, next one is for you. We had a couple of questions related to the kind of idea of decentralization that you were talking about. What do you think prompted this decentralization, and also, what kind of evidence do you see for it? And could, even if people are moving around, couldn't they take this sort of like centralization or political control kind of with them, or does it have to be tied to like a place?
Yeah, they could. There's just no evidence for it. Yeah, I mean, the evidence for decentralization is just in the sort of the basic empirical facts that, these big civic ceremonial centers, it probably, requires some sort of centralized leadership, in the sense, the people needed to aggregate there at certain times of year, right? So there were probably ritual leaders that coordinated that kind of thing. These are big sort of extravagant sites like Crystal River, and Kolomoki. So I'm not saying they were under centralized political control. There's not much evidence for that, but there was certainly some kind of centralized decision-making regarding the sort of timing of a ritual calendar and things like that. So it's just a basic empirical fact that these civic ceremonial centers are breaking down, and they're largely settling across the landscape and these sort of smaller midden sites. So for instance, this like shell mound located on the Nature Coast up by Cedar Key, after 650, people move away from the big site and they sort of start occupying all these little small islands. So, I mean, I guess there could be centralized political control in a sense, but there's just no evidence for that. I would expect there to be another emergent mountain center popping up at that same time, and there's just nothing to suggest that. I would expect some kind of homogenization of some material culture, and it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Lindsey, next one for you. This one's from Sherry and Alan, and they ask, how do the results of your research compare to present day scalloping seasons and different scalloping practices or regulations? Oh, sorry.
It's basically, yeah, the same thing. So like, present day scalloping, regulations are becoming more limited because of the, climatic changes. We've seen a lot of pollution in Tampa Bay, increase in water temperature, loss of those seagrass beds. So they're moving them out and they're regulating them more strongly now as an effect of that climatic change as we saw before.
All right, Trevor, this one's from Marty. He said,
Okay.
the Florida Panhandle and Southwest Georgia sites, Kolomoki included, seem to have grown around 650 and then depopulated a little over a century later. Would environmental disruption in peninsular Florida and then re-aggregation further north produce similar patterns to the model you're proposing?
Yeah, so I mean, that's true. I am sort of homogenizing. When I say late woodland, I'm kind of glossing over all this variation. It does seem that in the Panhandle, like Marty said, and at Kolomoki specifically, there's actually a bit of a boom, as we get this hypertrophic village expansion that they've written about before. But at least in the peninsula, Crystal River seems to go offline pretty early. Shell Mound certainly does as well as St. Martin Patch. In terms of, I'm not exactly sure, again, the environmental change angle is just like kind of an easy cop-out. I admit that. People tend to say, these things, change everything. Every little climatic oscillation changes what people do. I'm not necessarily saying that. There are certainly maybe political movers and shakers that are creating, this kind of variation that caused migration. And like Marty said, if that is the case, it would have caused, aggregation in these centers, these northward migration at Kolomoki. But I don't think it affects the model just in the sense that if people are experiencing crisis, they, this religious model, or, ritual specialization model, this sort of leaning on ritual leaders for, for spiritual guidance and things like this, still wouldn't have really changed that much, regardless of, the sort of environmental or political circumstances, if that makes sense.
All right, and then I got a couple questions for you that are all related to the kind of Grog Temper and heirlooming that you were talking about.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's like I know, every time I hear about that, I think it's like a really neat aspect. But okay, so Heidi asked, what evidence is there that the reuse of pottery is due to heirlooms versus just reusing pottery that may be ritually or accidentally broken? And then Colin also asked, and then where did they get these source pots for the temper, and were they also funerary vessels?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Becky, could you read the first half of the first one more time?
Yeah, sorry.
I got the second one.
What evidence is there that the reuse of pottery in this Grog Temper is due to heirlooming versus just reusing the pottery that may be ritually or accidentally broken?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. So it is basically the fact that from the pots that we've analyzed thus far, it looks like most of that safety harbor pottery is locally produced. So the chemical signatures, the mineral signatures suggest that they're locally produced. The only time that they're getting a whole lot of non-local influence is during this Weedon Island period. That seems to be when a lot of these Weedon Island red vessels, these effigy vessels that have the non-local signatures, that have those micaceous clays in them, that's the only time we really have evidence for that. So I'm not saying it's a smoking gun that they're using those Weedon Island pots as vessels, as heirlooms to temper other pots with. But I think there is definitely an association between that past non-local signature with Weedon Island and non-local production and the late woodland period, as opposed to those safety harbor vessels, are mostly produced locally. So if they're just using vessels that were made locally and recycled, then I would expect them to have the same exact fabric as the host pot, but they're very different in a lot of circumstances. So again, I have, that's why I'm doing ICP-MS to really source this out. or suss this out through sourcing, source this out. Yeah, so that's kind of what's going on there. And hopefully that kind of answers Colin's question a little bit too.
No, that makes sense. All right, one last one from Tom. He said, Trevor, good job. You know me, not overly materialist, but any functional advantages of grog over sand or limestone? Maybe decreases lamination we see in so much other pottery at the same time, but still would not negate the argument about heirlooming since they did not need to use ground up imported pots.
Yeah, there are definitely functional advantages to having to Grog Temper. And the main thing is that the plasticity of the heated pot and the crushed pots that have already been heated are almost identical. So you really risk, Stepanidis has sort of made this argument, you know, time and again for Moundville, because that's what, you know, you see supposedly this boom in Grog Temper pottery right as Moundville is sort of reaching its peak, right? And so, yeah, that's his argument, basically, that there is a distinctive functional advantage to using pottery, tempered pottery, because it is, the plasticity is identical and you really reduce thermal shock and thermal stress when firing. And I definitely think that's absolutely true. But the problem is that I just don't see them in the domestic vessels. So the domestic vessels in general are much sandier. Like there's still a lot of evidence. There's the classic Pinellas lamination, but there is that, you know, they're much sandier in general. That's another thing with the mortuary vessels. It seems like they're highly processed. The point counting suggests that they're really matrix heavy. And it's really just clay and grog. There's not a whole lot of impurities and inclusions. Whereas the Pinellas has a lot of clay lumps in it, a lot of phosphatic nodules, things like that. So if pottery really was part of this, you know, broad technological revolution, I would kind of expect it to be in the domestic context too, which I just don't really see. Again, I've only looked at probably 120 samples at this point, so that is far from exhaustive of the whole region, and this is only from a few sites. But you know, again, I would expect that to be kind of ubiquitous if technology was the driving factor, or material efficiency was the kind of driving factor with that. If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. Okay, Lindsey, one last question for you. I'll unmute you before I ask it this time. Okay. So Sally asked, do you have any preliminary taphonomic results for your Tampa Bay sites?
Yeah, so I just got finished with the taphonomic analysis for Tampa Bay, and I'm kind of going through and doing the official analysis, but preliminarily we have, you know, I'm seeing a sharp contact between the different levels. We have 9 different levels that we're working in, and we have a sharp contact of like weathering, like amounts of weathering we're seeing on the shells, the color of the shells. And then in the lower levels, the older scallops, we're seeing these interior worm tubes, and those would have, in their marine worm tubes, they would have been deposited when the shells were just shells and not living scallops when they were in marine waters. And so that raises an interesting question of why, because there's like, they cover like 80% of the shells there, which is not something we were seeing in Pineland, because that would mean that they were dead upon collection. So we were looking at different reasons why this might have been. And, you know, one of the hypotheses that we have is that, you know, when the communities are harvesting these scallops from marine waters, they're either throwing the shells in like a live well or on the shoreline. And then as, you know, time goes on, they're having to redistribute the shells, and then they're in their final deposition in that shell-midden ridge. So that's an interesting thing to, you know, be working towards, and trying to understand why there are so many shells that are technically dead upon collection when you wouldn't have expected to see that.
All right, well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Lindsey. We're excited to, you know, see where your research takes you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us today. Thanks everyone who joined us for our October lecture and meeting. I hope that actually, you know, this Saturday is International Archaeology Day. So I hope you check out some online events that are going on related to that. And thank you.